everybody, and welcome today to a detailed discussion of the poem in your course, Alexander Pope's An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Since this is a long poem, we shall discuss this over a course of 2 video lectures. I will begin with the first half today. This poem is written in the form of a conversation or a dramatic dialogue between the poet and Dr. Arbuthnot, his friend and physician. In its first publication in 1734, the poem was written like an address or an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. If you would remember from our previous lecture, we have discussed the qualities and the evolution of the epistle as a literary genre. However, the Warburton edition of 1754 contained interjections by Dr. Arbuthnot, thus making it a dramatic dialogue. However, the poem retains its original title as that of An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. The listener, Dr. Arbuthnot, intervenes at some points in the poem, even as Pope continues to express his disgust, despair, and anger at bad writing, fake friends, and vicious enemies. This poem could very conveniently be divided into 7 parts of unequal length. The first part, from line 1 to line about 70, expresses the poet's dislike for fake admirers. The poem opens in media res, as they say, in the middle of things, with Pope addressing an imaginary servant to lock up the door to his house and, I quote, to tie up the knocker, to say, I quote, I'm sick, I'm dead, end quote, so that he can escape all those poetasters and aspiring poets who are following him in order to seek advice or appreciation for the poetic works that they have written. Pope goes on to state how these people trail him everywhere to such an extent that there is absolutely no place left where he can find peace or leisure. I quote, "What walls can guard me? What shades can hide? They pierce my thickets, through my grot they glide. No place is sacred, not the church is free. Even Sunday shines, no Sabbath day for me." Pope presents here the picture of a harried, heckled, and hassled poet. He mentions how he's fed up of meeting such people and how desperately he desires to avoid them. This section talks about the artists whose own skills are not worthy enough. They try to convince Pope to amend the works that they have written so that they can be successful. And I quote from the poem, "Is there a parson much bemused in beer, a maudlin poetess, a rhyming peer, a clerk foredoomed his father's soul to cross, who pens a stanza when he should engross?" We notice that Pope takes names of people like the parson, a poetess, a rhyming peer, a clerk, signifying that anybody and everybody is trying their hands at poetry and expect Pope to clear up the mess that they have made and to give them advice which will make them successful. Pope thus mentions the negatives of being famous. The best advice that he can give to these aspiring poets, to these poetasters, is, with an honest anguish and an aching head, he tells them, keep your peace 9 years. Don't let it see the light of day. Don't let it see print for at least 9 years. In part 2, from line about 71 to around 124, Pope tries to convince Dr. Arbuthnot that he would not let his satires be dangerous. He won't, I quote, name queens, ministers, or kings, end quote. He's sure that whoever he ridicules would care more to mend his ways rather than to attack him. And we notice here that Pope presents himself as being genuinely motivated by a desire to cure the follies of the people who meet him rather than to abuse them. It is to be noted, however, that Pope is not serious in expecting that the noblemen and writers he ridiculed would not feel hurt. As he says, "Whom have I hurt? Has poet yet or peer lost the arched eyebrow, the Parnassian sneer?" What he's trying to say is no matter how hard his satires are, no matter how biting they are, none of these people are ever going to change. Pope creates here a word portrait of Bavius, a poet who attacked the ancient poets Virgil and Homer. This portraiture of Bavius serves a double purpose, as not only does Pope attack all those inconsequential poets who attack him, but he also places himself in the category of Homer and Virgil, stating that just like Bavius, this inconsequential poet, attacked the great poets Homer and Virgil, in the same way, these poet tasters and aspiring poets go around trailing him and attacking him. This tongue-in-cheek self-praise is characteristic of much of Pope's satire. It's also visible in the last few lines of his mock epic, Rape of the Lock, among others. But then Pope also says, I quote, "You think this is cruel? I take it for a rule, no creature smarts so little as a fool." Meaning, no matter what you speak to a fool, how you scold him, how you get angry with him, how you satirize him, or how you rail at him, he is not going to understand, simply because he is a fool. However, Pope states clearly that he is more afraid of fake friends than real enemies. As he says, I quote, "A fool quite angry is quite innocent. Alas, 'tis 10 times worse when they repent." He is able to see through the shallowness and the falsity of the praises that are heaped both on his intellectual abilities and his body. We've already discussed in our introductory lecture to Pope's life and works that at his tallest he stood only at 4 feet 6 inches, and that he suffered lifelong from this disease called Pott's disease, which was a tuberculosis of the bones and which left him horribly stunted and deformed. However, poets still end up praising his body, something that he also knows doesn't deserve any praise. And he quotes, "One dedicates in high heroic prose and ridicules beyond 100 foes. And there are those who to my person pay their court. Ammon's great son one shoulder had too high, such Ovid's nose, and, sir, you have an eye." End quote. They praise every part of his body, and Pope is only too conscious that no parts in his body are deserving of any kind of applause or praise. Part 3, from lines about 121 to 170, attempts to summarize Pope's life as a man of letters and of literature. He frankly states that his physical disabilities would not have allowed him to pursue anything other than writing. And at this point, we must also remember that Pope was born a Catholic, and all the other professions such as the law or the ministry or the clergy or the university or medicine were not open to Catholics. He had no choice but to turn to writing. Pope goes on to mention that he was a child prodigy, writing poetry from a very tender age. He goes back into his childhood and he talks with affection of himself as a child. I quote, "As yet a child, nor yet a fool to fame, I lisped in numbers, for the numbers came." The word numbers here stands for poetry, for rhymes, for stanzas. He also acknowledges here his debt to his friend Dr. Arbuthnot for taking care of him, and for treating his frequent bouts of illness. He further states that his calling, that is, his decision to turn to writing as a full time profession, enabled him to get through with what he calls this long disease, my life. We realize that Pope is painfully and acutely conscious of the physical troubles that he has had to live with, and he has no opinion about the greatness of his writing. He found, through his writing, lifelong friends like Granville, Walsh, Garth, Swift, Congreve, etc., and even some great friends and great people like St. John, who were close friends with his senior John Dryden. And that's what makes Pope say, I quote, "Happy my studies when by these approved, happier their author when by these beloved." And this tells us how happy and how good Pope felt about being friends with these great literatures of the 18th century. He also mentions, as he continues, that his initial poems were not biting satires. I quote, "Soft were my numbers, who could take offence, while pure description held the place of sense." He also continues, I quote, "Like gentle fannies was my flowery theme, a painted mistress or a purling stream." This couplet is an indication towards Pope's earliest work, the Pastorals, written in 1709, in which Pope attempted to evolve a theory of the relationship between man and nature. It was an idea that he was to discard much later as he got down to writing his satires and his other philosophical works. Therefore, Pope only began writing satires when some men of letters and some noblemen began attacking him in writing, apparently for no fault of his own. He bore with them for a while, graciously, either not responding to their attacks or responding gracefully. I quote, "I never answered I was not in debt. If want provoked or madness made them print, I waged no war with Bedlam or the Mint." The allusions to the word Bedlam or the Mint are a reference to a very famous mental hospital in London called Bedlam, therefore a place where madmen stay, and the Mint, which was the treasury, which was where all the money was minted. Now we come to part 4. From lines about 170 to 260, this part is a counterattack on those who denounced Pope. Pope states that he was puzzled by some critics attacking his inoffensive poems written during his early career, for example, the critics being Gildon or John Dennis. Some critics that criticized Pope were the editors, who were more or less obsessed to find petty mistakes in his work. Others opposed him because he did not support their unworthy, undeserving works. However, Pope tells Dr. Arbuthnot that he would be attacked no matter what he wrote, no matter what he did. And it is only now, when the attacks have gotten out of hand, that Pope has taken it upon himself to give a befitting response. And this is what Pope has to say. I quote, "Pain's reading, study are their just pretense. All they want is spirit, taste, and sense." This couplet points also towards the theory of literature prevalent in the 18th century, according to which a person could become a good writer only if he studied and emulated the works of the classical poets, the ancient Greek and Roman poets. However, as Pope rightly rues, no amount of study or imitation can turn a poet taster into a poet. If you do not have it, you cannot achieve it. Pope seems to be serious in this part of the poem, and this is reflected in the way he simplifies his syntax here. This part of the poem, part 4, also talks of Joseph Addison, his contemporary, a well known critic and writer, and also a noteworthy opponent, which is what Pope regards him as. I quote, blessed with each talent and each art to please, and born to write, converse, and live with ease. However, Pope states that Addison presented a bad example by considering himself perfect and therefore above all the others. It is here that Pope draws a satirical portrait of Joseph Addison as Atticus. Atticus reviles artists for the same art which brought him fame. He is like, and I quote, the Turk who will not tolerate even his brother near the throne. Once Atticus or Addison has achieved the height of popularity, he shuns all his friends and all his followers. Atticus is timorous, yet snide, and will neither praise nor dislike openly. Like Cato, the Roman orator, Atticus is attentive only and only to his own applause. He is ears only for those people who wish to praise him. Pope further distances himself from poets like Addison by stating that he has never begged for recognition from other writers or other poets. And I quote, I sought no homage from the race that write. I kept, like Asian monarchs, from their sight. Pope has never sued, bowed, and scraped for favors, whether from his contemporaries or from his superiors. Neither, says Pope, did he seek the company of, I quote, wits and witlings, that is, of half poets and poet tasters, in order to spread about the itch of verse and praise. Instead, says Pope, he left all of this for buffo, and it is here that we come across another word portrait of this person called Buffo in the poem, and who actually is one of Pope's contemporaries, Charles Montague, the Earl of Halifax, who is here satirized as Buffo. Pope regards Buffo as amphibious, a toad, and he calls him, I quote, full-blown Buffo. Buffo possesses a library of books which he has never read, and this library is graced by a headless bust, supposedly, since one can never know, of Pindar, the great Greek poet. Buffo is attended upon by aspiring poets and writers of all kinds who seek his patronage through sycophancy and flattery. And I quote, much they extolled his pictures, much his seat, and flattered every day, and some days eat. The only redeeming trait of this personage is that although he never patronized John Dryden, who was one of the great literateurs of the late 17th and the early 18th century, he still contributed money towards Dryden's funeral, thus helping to bury those he helped to starve. Pope puts in here a good word for John Gay, one of the least recognized literary talents of the 18th century and the author of the now celebrated Beggar's Opera. John Gay was also a member of the Martinus Scribularis Club, and his literary worth was recognized by Pope. Pope is thankful that Buffo did not patronize Gay, as that left Pope to do that good work. After this, a smaller literary portrait ensues, with Pope satirizing a man called Bub Doddington, 1691 to 1762, and this person is satirized as Bubo. Doddington was known for his pretentious patronizing and his political dishonesty. That will be all in this lecture on the discussion of Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. I shall continue and conclude in my next lecture. Thank you all. Bye-bye.